Welcome to vmtrooper.com, the chronicles of my journey into the cloud. Thanks for stopping by my blog. Today I'll be covering the installation process of the Nexus 1000V version 1.5 release. I was impressed by the updated installation workflow compared to previous versions, and after giving it a try, I think those who prefer the command line setup may consider giving the GUI setup a chance. So the first thing that you need to do is, of course, obtain the Nexus 1000V 1.5 download. I've already done that, but all it requires is a Cisco login for www.cisco.com. Those are free. And as long as your employer has the appropriate licensing with Cisco, you'll have your licenses for the Nexus 1000V, or you can do a trial just like you can try out most other VMware components. So let's get started. I have the download already here and unzipped, and now I'll be going through the graphical user interface installation method. So this is one of the times where just jumping in and trying to deploy everything may get you into a little bit of trouble. So the best way to start is going to the README that's included with the download, and then launching the GUI from the command line. You may want to go ahead and, as normal, import your OVF or OVA file, but actually using the installation GUI is a lot easier. So I already have it queued up here ready to deploy using the installation instructions from the README file. Okay, so after a brief pause, we have the Java GUI installation method brought up now. And yes, Windows, I'll be activating you later. So first things first, we have to identify the IP address of our vCenter server. Let's see if I get this right. And I'll put in my username and password. So far, nothing different than previous versions. But we'll see later on the benefits of this new version and the new Installation Management Center. So right now the GUI is connecting to the vCenter, retrieving the list of hosts, and getting all the other pertinent information that it needs. So I have my management cluster of one physical server. This is a test lab, so obviously this isn't best practice. So I'll put my VSM, that is the management component of the Nexus 1000V, on my management cluster server over here, and click Next. It's getting some more information, including the networking information that we will need a little bit later on. So I'll browse for my OVA file, and I'll go to the location where it's installed, or copied to. Make sure you go into the VSM folder, install, and select the OVA for your installation. Since I'm going to do an ESXi based Nexus 1000V as opposed to deploying to our Nexus 1010 appliance, where you can have virtual instances of 1000V running on an actual Cisco hardware appliance, we're going to use the one without that 1010 suffix. And we'll give it a name. VM. And then we need to choose the data store, either shared storage or local storage. I'll leave it local for now. And here's something that I thought was interesting. You have the option of standalone or HA, With an HA setup of 1000V, which is the recommended best practice for deployment in production, you'll have a primary VSM management module, and you'll have a standby VSM module that will share an IP, so that if anything happens to the primary, the standby is automatically ready and waiting to take over management of the individual virtual Ethernet modules that reside on your ESXi servers. But just remember, with 1000V, even if the VSM goes down, your virtual machine traffic will still continue flowing. It's not going to interrupt the data plane. The only time you'll notice a difference is if you need to do vMotion. So it's a good idea to have the VSM in an HA configuration, so that if the primary goes down, you can still do your vMotion and other necessary management functions excuse me, while you're waiting on getting the primary back up and running. Okay, so I'll click HA. What this will do is both the primary and the secondary will be deployed to this data store. Of course, that's not best practice. You want to have them on different data stores, and you can do that manually afterwards. Next, we'll go to the networking screen as we determine which VLANs and so forth are going to be used for communication. And also in the background is going ahead and deploying the actual VSM VMDK files to the target location. Okay, so we have to go ahead and configure whether we're going to use L2 connectivity or L3 connectivity between the ESX hosts and the VSM management interface. The only time you're going to use L3 is if your ESX hosts happen to be on different subnets than your VSM management module. Otherwise, you can go ahead and perform L2 connectivity. Now the options are a little different. With L3, we don't need to worry as much about the VLAN configurations on each location. What's more important is determining what are the IP address settings for the management and control interfaces. Okay, so I'll go ahead and click Next. Already on the correct VLAN. It's not necessary to have the control, management, and packet VLANs to be individual values. They can all reside on the same VLAN. Okay, so now we're going to configure the actual switch properties of the Nexus 1000V instance. You may be wondering, why are we providing the name twice? The reason is that we first provided the VM properties. Now we're going to provide the actual switch properties. And I'll just give it the same name. We'll give it a password. The installation routine will check the strength of the password. So if you base your password off of a regular word, it will prompt you for a different password to make it more secure. So this is the management IP address that you will connect to when you're doing your SSH connections to the switch for management purposes. Provide my subnet mask as well as my gateway. This domain ID value, for those of you who may not be familiar with the 1000V, distinguishes it from multiple instances of the Nexus 1000V. Some customers may want to have more than one domain ID, or sorry, have more than one 1000V in their environment. So to distinguish the management communication between the VSM instances and the ESXi hosts, you have to provide a unique domain ID that will not overlap between the 1000V instances. So I'll assign a domain ID of 201. And here you would verify the data center name for your vCenter. And if you have a native VLAN ID, you define it here. The native VLAN ID on my network is a default of 1. We're not going to be using it anyway, so we'll go ahead and specify it and click Next. And here we review the configuration of the switch, just to make sure that we haven't made any mistakes. Again, these 3 different VLANs that are used for the management of the entire 1000V system. They can be separate VLANs, or they can be a single VLAN, or some combination of the two. Some people put management on one VLAN and then control and packet on another VLAN together. Alright, so it's going to go and verify all of the information and properties that we entered, and it's going to write those properties to the VSM management interface. Okay, so we reached the end of the VSM deployment process. If you notice the time at the bottom right hand of the screen, it did take a few minutes, and I did edit appropriately to remove the dead air that while we were waiting for the configuration to complete. At this moment, I'm not entirely ready to migrate my hosts over to the DVS, the 1000V installation. So for now, I'll click No and click Finish. Okay, so we have a summary screen showing that the VSM was installed successfully, letting us know the properties, including the connection to the vCenter, as well as a refresher of how you can install the individual VEM modules, virtual Ethernet modules, that need to be placed on each ESXi host that will be managed by the VSM instance. If you have VMware Update Manager, and for those of you who are using 1000V, it requires the Enterprise Plus license, so you most likely you're already using VUM. You really would not need to use this command. Once you deploy the host to the VSM, it will automatically push out the VM using VUM. That was a little bit of a tongue twister there. Okay, so we'll click Close, and I'll go ahead and show you how to deploy your host to the VSM. So a couple things I want to highlight here. First of all, if you noticed, we only did one deployment of the VSM. However, we have 2 instances. As I was saying before, the HA configuration for VSM is to have a primary and a standby. And one of the improvements with the 1.5 release is that we do not have to do 2 separate deployments of the VSM. Once we select the HA deployment, it will deploy both the primary and standby VSM for us. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think it was there for the 1.4 version of the installer. Another improvement is if we go to Plugins, Manage Plugins, there was a manual step where we had to go to the HTTP server that's running on the VSM instance and download an XML file that is unique and tied to that particular VSM. And then we had to do a new plugin and upload that XML file into the plugin manager. As you can see here, I have 2 instances of the VSMs. The first one I did with my initial testing, and this one that I just created right now. And I have 2 plugins already in here. And another thing that might have confused users before is that the plugin would be in the available section. That hasn't changed. But then there would be a downloadable link saying download to enable the plugin or something like that, and it would be a link that will be clickable and might have confused customers a little bit. Now the status message there is a bit more useful. No client-side download is needed for this plugin. So those are two automated steps that I thought were pretty cool with the 1.5 installation GUI. Having the ability to deploy two VSMs from one run of the GUI instead of having to do it twice, and then defining which one's the primary and which one's the standby. And then also having to import that plugin XML file. It's done automatically. Of course, when you have your real management cluster in your production environment, your two VSM instances should be on different data stores as well as different hosts. So if you have DRS clusters enabled, you need to make sure you set the appropriate anti-affinity rules. All right, so let's go to the networking view so we can add a host to the new VSM that we deployed. And let's expand the VM Trooper VSM. Actually, we don't have any port profiles created for that one yet, so I'll just go ahead and deploy the second host to the VSM that I already configured. In a future blog entry, I'll be giving some examples on how to create your port profiles, but for now, we'll just go ahead and add the host to the existing VSM. So here's my other host that isn't part of the DVS yet. Some people like to leave at least one physical NIC linked back into the standard vSwitch just because they're not 100% comfortable with everything being on the DVS. However, it can be done either way. You can have one VM NIC on the vSwitch, the rest of your VM NICs on the DVS, or you can move everything over to the DVS. One benefit of the 1000V is that you can define system VLANs, and those VLANs are able to come up even if the VSM is rebooted or powered off or something like that. You won't lose your data plane connectivity. However, if you're more comfortable with leaving at least one VM NIC available on the vSwitch, that's fine as well. I'm going to put all my networking for this host, though, on the 1000V. So I select my truck uplink. I'm also going to migrate my management traffic. And I select my management port profile. I don't have any virtual machines on this host yet, so there's no virtual machine networking to migrate. And here we'll just have a review of what's being added to the DVS, the 1000V instance. Here, the VM kernel port and the associated IP address of my second host, as well as the network cards for my second host. So we'll see vSphere, the vClient, invoking VUM to deploy the VEM module to control the networking on the ESXi hosts, and it will go through its standard VUM procedures, deploy the VEM module, go ahead and perform the install, and the host will be officially managed by my 1000V instance. The VEM module is fairly small, so the installation process is pretty quick. And now I have both my hosts being managed by my 1000V instance. Okay, so if I go back to my host view, I see here that under the networking side, I have all of my DVS port groups enabled. And if I go to the if I go to the summary view of my second host, I see that as well. And if I go to the configuration screen, networking, I can go ahead and remove the standard switch since it's not being used for anything. And I just have my vSphere distributed switch, which is my 1000V instance. I have my VM kernel port under the management section, as well as my 2 VM NICs under the trunk uplink port profile that I created. Okay, well that's it for today's recording. Thank you for joining me today, and I'll see you in the next blog entry. Have a great day.